Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today on Sophos Managed Threat Response. I'm Danielle Chapman. I work in the marketing team here at Bytes. I'm delighted to be joined by Matt Gangwer, MTR Technical Director, and Eric Konas, MTR Senior Product Marketing Manager from Sophos, who will be presenting the webinar for you today. I'm also joined by Mark Simmons, Sophos Specialist at Bytes, who will briefly talk about the relationship between Sophos and Bytes. Okay, so I'm now going to pass you over to Mark.
Perfect, thanks Danielle. So I suppose I'm going to open this sort of webinar today is talk to you around here at Bytes and how we talk to our customers and understand as to where you are on your journey with in terms of endpoint security and sort of the revolution that's gone on within the market and the cyber security space. So hopefully across these couple of slides that I go through and what we talk with our customers about, it'll set you up nicely for the rest of the presentation that we'll go through with Matt and Eric. So we talk around an endpoint sliding scale, and we see that this is typically in 4 different stages. Typically 10 to 15 years ago, we took an approach to traditional AV malware scanning. And this is very much what we see today is more of a reactive cybersecurity on the endpoints and your servers. And this is combined with techniques that you'll use from protecting, policy driven. But ultimately, if there's anything that happens within your organization, you need to then go and make those changes to those policies. And ultimately, this isn't done automatically, which then provides potential threats and also spreading laterally throughout the organization. So we want to obviously advise and work with customers to achieve the best level of protection. And you'll see this throughout the next couple of slides. So we ask our questions as to where they are. So we then take the next step to protect. And the protect stage is what 10, 15 years ago was the react stage. Protection now, we see as typically the next generation endpoint. So looking at the likes of machine learning and AI to actually provide you a little bit more granularity and learn the behaviors of your company and what's normal for your organization, and then protects you from those unknown threats. And like I say, we'll show you a little bit more around that in the next few slides. The next one, we go into proactive security. So this is for organizations that want to take that, I suppose, a little bit more security conscious mindset and talk around or look into the threats within their organization. So actually finding pieces of malware within the organization and seeing whether that has spread across to any of their other endpoints. And these are done by tools like EDR. So we'll touch on that a little bit more. And then the last one is around the 24/7 managed offering, which is the focus of today's webinar. And as you go through this webinar, it'd be great for you to sit back and really think about, where you are on this sliding scale. When we speak to customers, we typically see that they're in between the react and protect. But ultimately, we want to achieve the customers getting towards the proactive side of things. So how do we do that? And the main aim of doing that is making you understand as to the level of protection you have today, what the organization looks like in strategy, and ultimately how we can then build out the portfolio and technologies to then ultimately get to where the end goal of being that proactive security and if needs be around the managed service offering. So I'm not going to steal too much thunder from the guys at Sophos, but hopefully this is a quick eye-opener in, I suppose, the different layers of protection that you can go through. And this will set you nicely as to what the guys at Sophos are going to talk to you about now. So I'll quickly hand over to those guys, if that's okay.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate the lead in. My name is Eric. I'm joined here by Matt. Matt leads our managed threat response team. We're going to be talking to you today about Sophos Managed Threat Response, and this is our 24/7 managed detection and response offering. I'm going to be talking more about what managed detection and response is, kind of where it fits in your security program and in your strategy. Matt is then going to talk a little bit about how the service works and how the Sophos MTR team conducts its day-to-day operations. Before that, though, it's always helpful to kind of get everyone centered around what we're seeing right now in the threat landscape. So we have this marketing slogan here at Sophos, and marketing slogan though it is a huge part of how we operate. So this notion of cybersecurity evolved. Obviously, we've been in this business for a very long time, and you can't have that type of track record without consistently adapting how you're responding to the threat landscape and the attackers that make it up. So every time we introduce a new product or a new service, it's always through the lens of what shifts are we seeing in the threat landscape? How are attackers adapting to the types of security controls that we're putting in their way? How can we stay ahead of that? And that's really a core part of how Sophos works, but especially how the managed detection and response team here works. So we're going to talk about the evolution of threats that we see in the landscape. So there's no shortage of information out there, different research studies that point to here are the most common types of threats. These are the things that we see most frequently in the marketplace. And that can be useful, but we prefer to look at what are the things that attackers are doing that lead to a successful attack. How are they getting to the point of having access to data or exfiltrating data from an environment. So we look at what are attackers doing that's working, not just what's most frequent. And so we kind of bundled into these 4 categories of things that our team sees on a regular basis from what we would consider more sophisticated attackers. Number 1 on the far left is living off the land techniques. So these are the types of techniques that attackers use where they are taking advantage of legitimate tools, system tools, that are often used by administrators to make their jobs easier. So these are things like PowerShell, PSExec, Windows management instrumentation, tools that have legitimate purposes, that serve a legitimate need. They're there for a reason, and that reason is to make administrators' lives easier. But when they are co-opted by an attacker, it allows them to execute functions and making it more difficult for people to detect those things as malicious. So how do you tell the difference between a non-malicious use of one of these tools and a malicious use? And this is something that security controls struggle with. They might be able to flag that an activity is happening, but arriving at that determination that this is something that's expected, it's non-malicious, versus this is something that is not expected, it's malicious, is something that still requires human intervention. And so tools might be able to surface some of these things. It still requires a human analyst to conduct an investigation to determine what is the nature of that activity that we're seeing. Is it malicious or is it benign? If it is malicious, what actions do we then need to take? So that's what we're seeing with living off the land. Very, very popular type of technique being used by attackers today. Number 2 is what we call automated active attacks. So this one's interesting because it's kind of ironic in that as the capabilities afforded to us through things like automation have really just kind of proliferated. It's lots more technology takes advantage of automation. And so you'd expect that attackers and the attacks that they're using are going to get increasingly more automated. That's true to a point, but we're actually seeing that attackers are using automation in the early stages of an attack to first gain an initial foothold in an organization, and then at that point, a human attacker takes over. And that human attacker, that person's goal is to do everything that they can to evade or prolong detection. So you've got a human attacker that's at the wheel who's conducting the next more sophisticated stages of the attack. A good example of this is with Ryuk ransomware. So this uses, again, automated means to gain that initial foothold and employs human ingenuity to evade detection. So there's a human behind this attack whose sole purpose is to circumvent and manipulate around your system without being detected. And so how do you deal with that? Well, again, it's just as attackers are using a combination of tools and human ingenuity, that's what managed detection and response is all about. Taking advantage of tools, arming analysts with tools, and then taking advantage of how their knowledge of attackers and how they operate as human beings to shut those attacks down before they start. Number 3 is covertly modifying security controls to evade or prolong detection. So this kind of piggybacks on the others, but one of the things that we're seeing from sophisticated attackers is once they get that foothold, now they're actively looking for ways to make their attack more successful by either turning off or changing security settings and configurations, or doing things like identifying the location of your backups and deleting them so that when they drop that ransomware, you're more likely to have to pay up because commonly the best defense against ransomware has been, well, have everything adequately backed up and just restore from backup. Great, but the attackers found that backup, they've deleted it, and now you're going to have to pay up that ransom. This is something that we saw with SamSam ransomware. You know, its handlers went out of their way to find the backups first and delete them. Our Sophos Labs team, which gathers a lot of this type of information, they analyzed payments made in Bitcoin while it's owned by SamSam attackers, and found that they've received $6 million in counting of ransom payments. So very, very successful attackers. And again, taking advantage of their surroundings, manipulating security controls once they're in. The fourth is exploitation of third-party vendors in the supply chain. So a supply chain attack occurs when someone infiltrates your system through an outside partner or provider. So as we know, in how most organizations conduct business today, there's a lot of folks outside of your organization who might have access to your data. They might even be storing some of your data. And so you could be doing everything right within your organization, but an attacker who's going into the supply chain and looking for a way to get in can be taking advantage of the fact that one of your third-party vendors has access to your data and maybe even access to your environment. So there's really no end to the major cybersecurity breaches that we've seen in the news that have been the outcome of this type of attack. Target is one of the biggest examples where that attack started with one of their HVAC vendors. Equifax is another one of those where that started with a third-party vendor. And other research has found that 56% of organizations have had a breach that was caused by one of their vendors. So again, that can be, a kind of frightening thing. Hey, I'm doing everything right in my environment. I'm following all the best practices. I have everything set up correctly, but it's one of my vendors, and either their carelessness or just, something that they weren't expecting takes advantage of them, which results in a breach on your end. So this is kind of the landscape that we're seeing right now, and you'll see how we've designed our service to address every one of these particular types of techniques that are being used by attackers. So I mentioned before we were going to talk more about what managed detection and response is. Managed detection and response is, if it's a term that you've heard or if you've just heard it referred to as MDR, there's still a lot of questions around it, and for good reason. It's a fairly new entrant into the security marketplace. It was only in 2016 that Gartner coined the term managed detection and response to be referencing those types of organizations that were moving a bit beyond just security technology management and actually doing that type of proactive threat hunting and response work, getting to the point of actually neutralizing threats. And so, it hasn't been around a very long time, at least as a term. The team that we have here at Sophos has been doing this since before it had a name. In fact, when Gartner first released its initial market guide in managed detection and response, it was our team that was included, among a very few number of providers at that time. And since then, it's kind of skyrocketed. And again, it's skyrocketing because we are responding to what we're seeing in the threat landscape. So a simple way of thinking about what MDR is, again, it's that combination of tools and people. It's taking advantage of security tools that we have, bringing that together with the brightest minds that we have in the space, human analysts who can leverage those tools and even utilize outside tools to thoroughly conduct an investigation. But the ultimate goal is to neutralize threats before they result in a breach. And that that kind of seems like an obvious one, but it's an important piece. What we've seen from some of Gartner's research is that clients who have the most successful security operations centers are putting the premium on people rather than process and technology. So people and their value and what their capabilities are far overshadows the capabilities of the technology that they have in terms of how successful that security operations center is going to be. So this is kind of what you would think about. It's as we've seen all kinds of different tools and gadgets in the security marketplace, we're seeing this return to human analysts and the importance of human intervention in response to what we're seeing from the attack landscape. So what's the goal? What are we actually trying to achieve? And I started to mention this before, but at the end of the day, security program objectives are pretty simple. Detect attacks on sensitive data assets and neutralize incidents before they become a breach. I mean, that really should apply to just about everyone, and it's so simple that you can write it in crayon, but it's kind of an important piece of just thinking about security through the fundamentals. And so what does it take to achieve that objective? Well, you can break that down into three categories: protection, detection, and response. So when it comes to protection, that's the ability to prevent attacks and proactively secure known vulnerabilities. So things that we know that are threats, do we have the controls in place to be able to identify them and shut them down very, very early? Next is detection. can we detect an active attack or an attempted attack that we've identified as based on potentially malicious behaviors? Can we see new activity in an environment, and can we identify that and confirm that, yes, this is a valid threat that requires further investigation and response? And then last is response. Can we rapidly investigate and respond to these actions to minimize their impact? And so what we've seen, especially over the past decade, is there's been huge strides made on the protection and detection side. And Sophos is, thankfully for our team, is one of the market leaders in providing the tools and technology that allow us to protect and detect new threats in environments. But where a lot of organizations are still struggling is with response. And again, it's because you have to have that human element that's leveraging those tools. And as most people know, there's a massive shortage of cybersecurity talent in the marketplace. There's a ton of unfilled jobs. There just aren't enough people to go around. And so that's why services like this exist. We have that team. It can be much more cost effective to implement that team into your security program without having to go and recruit, train and retain that type of talent internally with your organization. So we're really focused again on that respond element, but you'll see as Matt is talking through some of our capabilities from a tool standpoint, we also have the ability to detect a lot more that other tools might not be capable of. So why does this exist? Number one thing that we have heard from customers who have, mostly those who have used a managed detection and response service before, is that they're tired of services that don't take action on their behalf. The expectation is because of the name, managed detection and response, is that when you get a service, that team is going to be responding on your behalf. The reality of the situation is that there are very, 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 very few providers in the marketplace that will actually take those types of actions on response of a customer. More often than not, they're monitoring your environment, they're notifying you of potential threats, and then it's left to the customer or the customer's partner to conduct an investigation, determine the scope and validity of those threats, and then determine what response actions need to be taken, and then actually initiate those actions. So that's another thing that we wanted to make sure that as we were launching this service with Sophos, that this was something that was at the very top of our list of things that we wanted to do for customers. We wanted to make sure that we were taking those actions to neutralize those threats. And I'll get to that here in a second. There's some other customer challenges that are very common. Here are the four that we hear most frequently. Far left, it's difficult to find and retain top talent to manage our program. Again, I mentioned there's that massive talent shortage. It's difficult to find people who can utilize these tools, especially as the tools get more complex and more featureful. It requires more specialist capabilities, and not every organization has the ability to resource for those types of positions. Number two, we're not optimizing the value from the tools we bought. We went out, we identified the best tools in the marketplace, but we're not getting the most out of them. Again, part of that is just not having the right people who are able to use them. Part of it is that tools are getting increasingly more complex to use. Number three, we need someone hunting for threats that tools can't detect. This is an important thing. Even though we've seen great strides in our capabilities from a tooling standpoint and their ability to detect and even respond to certain threats, we know that attackers are always going to be changing their tactics. They're always going to be looking for ways to work their way around those types of tools. So that's where really it requires a human who's conducting a threat hunt to be able to identify those threats that maybe we haven't seen before in the wild just yet. Maybe it's brand new. It's a new indicator of attack, a new indicator of compromise. We haven't seen it yet. That requires a human to identify those things. And then last is we're growing and our security program needs an upgrade. And this is for organizations of all sizes. We've seen large enterprise organizations that are all of a sudden realizing that they don't have a security program that's as mature as maybe other functions of their business. On the opposite end, we've seen this with organizations that are very small, technology startups that have really invested in making sure that their product is selling and marketed well, and that they're doing the things that are revenue generating, and they haven't been able to put a focus on security, which is increasingly more important as they go to market with their products or services. So what is Sophos MTR? What does all this lead to? We've talked about the threat landscape, some of the challenges, the goals of a program. Here's what we wanted to be able to provide customers. So this is our service. Starts with 24/7 human-led threat hunting. Again, it's a service, not a product. These are human beings who are working 24/7, eyes on glass, proactively identifying things and taking actions on your behalf. Number two, we investigate suspicious activities, not just detections. So this team of analysts, they're not just fielding alerts from the tools that they have at their disposal. They're looking at the things that may not generate an alert. What are the things that don't cross that threshold of triggering an alert from a tool that if we start to look at them a little more closely, maybe we can identify these behaviors as being something new from attackers. So again, we're looking at activities, not just detections. And then last and most important, while a lot of monitoring and response companies focus on notification, packaging up an alert, sending it to the customer, and then leaving it to the customer to take action, we take those actions on behalf of our customers. We have one of our salespeople who kind of uses the example, a lot of MDR providers in the marketplace are kind of like hiring someone to come clean your house, and all that person does is leave you a list of things that are dirty, and then it's up to you to have to clean them up. With our service, we're not creating work for you. We're taking those actions so that, you know, we're doing as much as we possibly can to neutralize that threat so that you don't have to worry about it. So you can focus on the things that are more important to you. What does the MTR team do? You know, very succinctly, again, Matt's going to go into some more detail, but just at the highest level, we're proactively hunting for and validating potential threats and incidents. We're then going to take all the information that we have at our disposal to determine the scope and severity of those threats. We're going to apply the appropriate business context for valid threats. This is an important one. Our analysts, again, human beings, they can think about why is an attacker going after this particular asset? Why is an attacker targeting this particular user? This context is important, being able to prioritize and respond to these types of threats. It's something that only a human being can do today. We're going to provide actionable advice for addressing the root cause of incidents. We don't just want to be responding to things and responding to the same things day after day. We want to make sure that we're addressing the root cause and overall improving your security posture, being proactive, not reactive, and solidifying your defenses. And then last, we're going to initiate those actions to disrupt, contain, and neutralize those threats. We typically see 3 scenarios play out in terms of a detection and response scenario. So scenario 1 is we have a tool in place that detects an attack or a suspicious behavior. Now, what does that look like from a response standpoint? Well, if the tool has seen this type of thing before, it knows that it's a known threat, and it knows enough about that particular threat to automate the correct response. So the threat's been neutralized. We've done it all through a tool. That's scenario 1. Again, that's what a lot of our Sophos products are best at, is really just shutting attacks down before they can really get started. Now let's look at scenario 2. Scenario 2 is a tool detects an attacker behavior, but it doesn't know enough about this attacker behavior to automate a response. Hasn't seen it before, or it simply can't make a conviction. It can't decide whether or not this activity is malicious or benign. So this is, again, where an analyst is going to have to conduct an investigation to confirm the nature of that particular activity. Is this something bad, or is this something that is perfectly harmless? And then they're going to determine, based on that, what response actions need to be taken, and they're going to execute on that plan. And then the last part, really coolest part about how we operate with the rest of our team here at Sophos, is we're going to take the outcome, the learnings from that investigation, the learnings from the response action that we took, and feed that back into our tool set so that the tools become better at automating that process. So the things that we do here effectively in scenario 2 become things that can be handled programmatically in scenario 1. Our humans are better able to perform their job using the tools, but then our humans also make our tools better, which is a great kind of situation for us as an organization. So here is where most MDR services stop. They will identify certain behaviors, they will send it to the customer, left to the customer from there to determine what if this is malicious or benign and what actions need to be taken. So let's look at scenario 3. So scenario 3 is the tool doesn't detect any type of behavior. And obviously, since it hasn't detected anything, it certainly can't take any type of response. So this is where an analyst who's conducting a threat hunt discovers a brand new indicator of compromise, something we haven't seen before. The analyst is going to conduct an investigation to confirm if this new indicator of compromise is malicious or benign. And then they're going to determine what actions they're going to take. And again, outcome from that investigation process gets fed back into the tool set. So with Sophos Managed Threat Response, we're able to address all 3 of these scenarios, and you see how much further we go from some other providers that are out there. Before I turn it over to Matt, I just also wanted to show, here's some of the players that are in the space. Here's kind of what that landscape looks like of different managed detection and response providers. For those of you who look at analyst reports from Gartner, Forrester, and others, unfortunately, the space is still too new for them to have. Gartner doesn't have a Magic Quadrant report on managed detection and response. Forrester doesn't have a Forrester Wave report. The most comprehensive report is this one from Forrester. This is their most recent NowTech report on managed detection and response. And you see that they've broken different providers based on the level of efficacy with which they provide their service. And you see Sophos there in that top category, full-scale forensics, the most robust offering that does the most for customers. So just wanted to kind of provide that type of overview. Hopefully you have a better understanding of the managed detection and response space and how and some of the value that we bring to the table. I'm now going to turn it over to Matt so he can give you a little bit more information around how the team works, what they do, and how they bring all this stuff to life. So Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So one of the first questions that we often get asked is, what does a team look like? What are the roles that you have available to support your customers? And we really have broken it down based on kind of the workload that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And that's, we have threat analysts on our team that are responding to detections and cases that the tools that we're using are bringing to our attention. They're doing that initial triage and investigation to determine if something is benign or malicious. We have our threat hunters who are out there looking for things that are getting potentially past detections or using new tactics and techniques where we may not have rules created for them, and really kind of having their ear to the ground, figuring out what new things malware or adversaries are doing, so then we can turn those into repeatable detections for our team to use. And then we have our incident responders who, when either through a case or a threat hunt, we get to a point where something is what we believe to be an incident, there's risk, there's something spreading on the network, our incident response team will step in and then start coordinating kind of that effort with our clients and customers to contain and neutralize the threat. So these are three teams, or our three groupings of individuals, work very closely together within our org to make sure that we're dealing with things that are coming to us, finding new things, and then also making sure that the processes and procedures are there when something does happen, and we can smoothly move through those investigations. In order to make sure that we're providing succinct and consistent services for our customers, we've built a lot of our process around what we call our investigative framework. We put this in place, one, to make sure our customers were confident in how we went through our investigations when we were looking at these things, looking at these security events and these alerts. And also, we want to make sure that we have points that we can measure our team from an investigation, hunting, and incident standpoint. It's based off of the OODA model, so observe, orient, decide, act, because in our line of work, it's never really one path per se, or one data point that may indicate something's malicious, and oftentimes it takes a number of different pieces of information to really have a good idea on what's going on, and getting to the point where somebody is confident in being able to take actions or to know what needs to be done next. And those are some of the key things that this method attempts to identify and address with the process. So it looks like this from a flow chart perspective, and we use effectively the same process for both automated cases or automated detections, as well as a manual case, which in our world is a threat hunt. So the first part of the process is us receiving some sort of piece of information. So on a detection, we have some sort of identified abnormal activity through a rule. Through a threat hunt, it's potentially a hypothesis, or somebody is wanting to go out and answer a question or see if this activity is present within our data set. So they're really taking that first piece of information and they'll orient that around some different pieces of information that we call lead indicators. So is there some sort of framework that we can map the activity to? We use MITRE a lot on our team. What kind of IOCs and IOAs, indicators of compromise and indicators of attack do we see? And do we know if there's user or asset information available for the specific alert? or detection. We take that, we then start pivoting around that information to pull back other investigation details. So again, we're looking at other pieces of data that surround those lead indicators, ultimately trying to come up with additional observables or things that build our confidence in what we're observing. We ultimately want to answer the questions in the bottom left. So is what we're observing malicious? Was the activity successful or did it fail? And what was the extent of it? So was it isolated to a single asset, or was it maybe something that we saw running or trying to execute on 5 to 10 different resources? And how was it successful? So then that we can kind of address root cause. All of these questions really help us assess the scale and ultimately what we need to do from a response action. So if it's an isolated incident, maybe the response action is, we can issue a command or do something on that endpoint that we can terminate whatever is happening. But if it's a widespread attack or an outbreak, then maybe it's more coordinated response that needs to take place, which then would engage kind of an incident response procedure on our side and likely in our customers' environment as well. So on the MTR team, we leverage several different Sophos tooling, one being our InterceptX plus EDR. So we get a lot of great telemetry off of that, mainly around preventions and protections that tool has seen or blocked. So we get all this really good intel from that tool. Additionally, with the MTR team, we have a different bundled agent that also will get deployed on endpoints and servers. And this agent allows us then much deeper insight into kind of the state of an endpoint or a server. And through leveraging kind of these two mechanisms, we have the ability to perform scheduled queries. So these are searches that are executed periodically. Some of them run every 20 seconds to pull back process executions and network traffic. Some of them run every hours, maybe that's around user data. Some of them run every 4 hours. That might be around file activity or registry modifications. So we have all of this data available to us through these pre-canned queries that are recurringly running on these endpoints. These pull back into our MTR data platform, where then we have 7 days of kind of historical data from that raw data to be able to look if we get in a case that we can investigate, we can perform threat hunting over it, and ultimately, attempt to use that to find whether or not something's malicious or uncover activity to escalate. The second way we collect data is through live query, which this is very similar to the first one, yet these are more ad hoc. They're run on demand, and these are typically ran when we're performing threat hunting, when we have a very specific question that we want to ask, or an instant response if maybe we need to see how many endpoints in the environment have this specific file and this path present. We can issue that out to a live query and get real-time results. So the interesting thing is with these live queries, it's an immediate state of that machine. So whereas some other technologies allow you to search over that data to see if it's present, we ask the device and get a real-time result back as to whether or not what we're looking for exists or doesn't exist. So it's very high fidelity from that perspective. So like I said, we pull data back into a different system that's specifically designed for our kind of analysts and our threat hunters to use. And we classify things in what we call detections, and that's kind of what's on the screen here. So a detection is an event, a combination of events of adversary activity that may not be malicious, but it's something that has triggered a rule on our side, and an analyst is going to look at it if there's a specific threshold. So we use 7 and above, where that gets put in front of somebody to investigate. The other detections that we, that are under those thresholds will get reviewed as part of our threat hunting exercises. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But so, you know, when one of these rules or these data points fire, we have all of this information kind of at our disposal. We see all of the host information, the username that was authenticated at the time that it was run, and the full command path with arguments for that specific threat. So it really gives us kind of high fidelity information about what was executed or ran, and then we can from there pivot around this event to see, you know, what other, you know, if this process ran, did it make network connections? Or there are other related processes. So maybe I want to see like a process tree for this to see if it spawned anything additional or where it came from. I have all of that information readily available, and I can immediately start pivoting around. So why that that view there of a detection, this is more of an aggregate view. So we'll see all of these things together, and it really starts to paint a picture as we're doing review of an incident or a case or a threat hunt, to see these things happening in order. So here on this specific example, you know, we can see we saw some reconnaissance tools being run, and specific to what Eric was talking about earlier, using like living off the land techniques. So ipconfig, system info, PowerShell, these are all utilities that are natively installed in a Windows environment that are often used by malware and adversaries to get information about what the system is, how it's connected, what's it connected to, and just general information about the asset. And then we can kind of see the subsequent commands running of, okay, now we have command.exe, which probably spawned the PowerShell, and we can see some other attributes. So we kind of use all this information in context, whereas maybe a single one of these events, such as the systeminfo.exe running, isn't bad, but in combination with all of these other things surrounding it, it is potentially something that we want to look into, and that's kind of the path that our analysts would take as they're going through and performing their investigation, to make sure that we're pulling back all of the information that we have available to us to really come to a good conclusion and consensus on what we're seeing, so we can make sure we're escalating true positives over to our customers. So jumping into a use case, this was an interesting situation where we had one of an account within our customer environment that was a privileged account. They fell victim to kind of a drive-by compromise where there was a fake Firefox update that popped up in their browser. They clicked it and it downloaded an update package that looked to be you know, Firefox update. So they executed this. You know, it was a new file. There wasn't signature detections for it at that point. However, with the MTR tooling enabled on that system, we were able to see, you know, once that JavaScript or that file was executed, we could see the activity of the underlying command. So it started running PowerShell and kind of the earliest stages of the attack, and we were able to, we had detections built for this specific PowerShell commands that we're executing, which then led one of our analysts to start investigating it. So that's how we ended up detecting this one, with some kind of secondary or tertiary information. You know, we may not have caught the initial download or browser-based drive-by, because that's not necessarily what our tools are there to detect. However, we did see kind of the after it was there, after it had been ran, you know, we saw the activity that matched what we monitor for adversary behavior, and we're able to then escalate and work with the customer here to determine what was going on. So, you know, this ended up compromising some administrative credentials in this environment. So we worked with them to clean all this up, respond to it, remove the PowerShell, and ultimately get the usernames fixed. So at the end of the day, this was kind of the after action summary that went out of this case. So you can see that there's a lot of activity that we observed. So we saw the file being downloaded, we saw it reaching out to command and control domains, and then some other commands through the PowerShell scripts that it was running to enumerate hosts and other things. So it's a really good use case of where we're able to kind of detect adversary tactics and techniques prior to it becoming a more large scale or high impact event, such as the final payload of this being ransomware that's potentially going to then infect servers. So we were able to identify it, cut it off, and respond to it before that activity happened.
One thing that I always like to kind of point out about this particular case, one, I mean, anytime these types of attacks are targeting someone with administration privileges, you can see in some of the notes here that user account that had those admin privileges was engaging with almost 600 different devices in their environment. So this is, again, attackers operating in a very savvy way, going after individuals in the organization where they can have the most leverage and really cause the most damage. And then you see in this type of report, this is obviously not an automated report. This is something that was compiled quite rigorously by an analyst, identifying here's the typical type attack chain that we see, and then here's the activity that we observed in your environment and what actions we took against it. So just a great, I think, example of how attackers are operating, the types of techniques that they're employing, and then how our team can identify and stop those things from becoming a problem later in the attack phase.
Yeah, and we're able to get a lot of really great intelligence when we're trying to review and analyze these samples through our labs, Sophos Labs organization. So they're often engaged at this point to help do some analysis on the initial executable or JavaScript, and really then push out protections globally. So as we're out there on the front lines identifying new content, new techniques that are happening, we're constantly also submitting those over to our labs organization to get protection out globally for all of Sophos customers, not just the MTR customers. Another use case here was with fileless crypto mining. So another common attack that we're seeing where there's not much residue on disk, and a lot of things are happening either through remote instrumentation and then through memory or fileless attacks. And this one leverages some of those technologies and tools that Eric was mentioning earlier about WMI. So similarly to the last one, we had observed some, not the actual WMI persistence on these machines, but when those consumers and bindings through the WMI had been executed, we observed some of the subsequent commands, such as PowerShell, being executed. So we're, then able to see those commands and then determine where that PowerShell was coming from. So it ended up, we traced this back to being WMI. So then therefore, we understand at that point that it's likely something that had propagated across the network. And we can then start working with the customer to start shoring up either the vulnerability that was used to propagate the account that was potentially compromised to do the installation remotely. But ultimately then, we have a lot of visibility into the different components on our MTR protected systems that some of the other core Sophos products don't, and our team's very fluent in using it. So the other thing to point out here too, this was a very brand new customer to our team, so it kind of shows the immediate benefit of installing and deploying, where so we have some specific things that we go through, such as like health checks, where we analyze InterceptX policies. I don't even think we had gotten to that point before we started seeing some of these detections. So, they hadn't even completed deployment, but, as they were pushing this out to a few machines, we immediately started seeing some of this activity and was able to get it to the customer to respond and tell them how to remediate. So in this case, we were in response or authorized mode, so we ended up deleting or removing the WMI consumers, filters, and bindings on this one through some of the response actions that we have available to us. So last, kind of the previous stuff was talking about detections, cases. So those are things that are programmatic generations of data that come to our team. This last section, we'll talk about threat hunting, what threat hunting is and the different types of threat hunting that can be performed. So we view threat hunting on our team as a pretty integral part of our team. So it's a human-led investigation. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a system that is identifying these signals or creating data points, but the human is actually the one kind of piecing and putting those things together in an effort to discover new indicators of attack and new indicators of compromise. Kind of the one core objective that I have for our team when we're doing threat hunting is we should really never have to do the same threat hunt twice. You know, if we're able to identify or search for something and then we identify that it is successfully identifying malicious activity, that's then something that can be turned into a prevention mechanism or a rule to detect it going forward, and we shouldn't have to use threat hunting to continue to see that. So we use it as a mechanism to make sure that our protections constantly are getting enhanced and benefit from kind of that analysis that we have somebody doing with that data. So there's three types of threat hunting. There's going to be the automated way, automated threat hunting, which is, you know, the rules, the tools that are generating nuggets of information for somebody to look at. There's lead-driven threat hunting, where then we, you know, look over some of the system-generated artifacts to piece together. So thinking back to the one screenshot of all of the detections that we see, that would be a great place for our team to start kind of doing a lead-driven threat hunt, where these are all the things the tool has generated as potentially malicious. Seeing them in this kind of order would then lead me to wanting to escalate that to a customer. And then finally, we have lead-less threat hunting, where this is much more hypothesis-driven. We don't have specific data at our fingertips when we start this. You know, we go into this more as we ask a question, or we maybe have heard of new attacker behavior and we want to go see if our data contains any of that activity. So we pose a question, you know, can I see X type of activity across some of my endpoints? We figure out how we're going to go perform that search through the data, whether it's in the data we collect or through maybe a live query, and then we go execute on it, analyze it, and see if the hypothesis is true or not. So it's much more free form, but much more lucrative in the long run as we're going through those, because those are really the good pieces that will turn into good rules and detections and preventions going forward. So where we start with threat hunting is in a few core places and with these data sets. So on the endpoint, you know, we're looking for, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, it's just kind of a good representation of some of the data that we have available. So process, execution, registry data, file artifacts, these are all things that we get from our endpoint agent, session data, IDS, firewall, and DNS from the network. We can get this from XG, our firewalls, and security data, obviously, threat intelligence through our labs organization, and alerts through our 6 Intercept X with EDR product. So in combination, you know, we can use one of these data points to start, but likely we'll end up going into multiple columns to really, really start performing our threat hunt to identify if there's something that we should be escalating, detecting, or preventing. So it's just a good kind of representation of the data that's leveraged day to day to perform that activity. And finally, a kind of example of how a threat hunt, a leadless threat hunt, can be successful. And this is a really good use case, in my opinion, of it's not always particularly a security incident that we're helping our customers with. You know, in this specific use case, it wasn't there wasn't an adversary on the network, it wasn't an active attack. It was really just some bad hygiene that we uncovered from a third-party vendor. So we proposed kind of the question that we see here, base 64 encoding being a common technique for fileless malware, installation, persistence, and evasion. So we'll start with that kind of question in mind, and then craft our either searches or our queries for the data that we have to then go try to identify or uncover that information, and then analyze kind of that sub-result set of the data that's returned. So during this hunt, we started pulling back a lot of information from the endpoints, and we were seeing a lot of command line execution running with base64 encoded data, which in our world is a common indication that there's something abnormal or nefarious going on. So as we started investigating, doing some decoding of what was in that base64 payload, we actually were able to determine, there were usernames and passwords within base64, and as we're all aware, base64 is not encryption, so it's easily reversed and easily uncoverable by somebody else. And we also saw that data was being sent out to a remote IP. So definitely a couple of things there that looked suspicious, but in the end, this ended up being a third-party application that this customer was using that was doing some analytics on the endpoints, collecting information and sending that back up to their kind of analysis engine. So again, not malicious, but just poor practice, poor hygiene. And we ended up working with this customer and the vendor in this case to tweak some of the settings and configurations to make it so this wasn't happening anymore, and that the usernames were being protected over the wire. So just a overall good use case of how the MTR team can help in a number of different situations. And with that, I think that leaves us with several minutes to take questions, if anybody has any questions.
Thanks, Matt and Eric. I would now like to open it up to any questions. If you do have any questions, please submit them in the questions box, which is just the right-hand side of your screen on the control panel. So what types of response actions can you initiate?
Yeah, I can take that one. This is Matt. So we of course have response capabilities through the InterceptX with EDR solution, which is going to be some kind of like host isolation, and other kind of configuration options. So if we identify, say, a bad hash or a bad IP, we can block that estate-wide, and we leverage that as kind of a first means to take response. But through the MTR system, we also have the capability to run playbooks, which are more kind of targeted response actions, such as killing a process that we suspect to be malicious, or removing a file that we know to be bad, or potentially grabbing a file that we suspect to be malware, so we can further analyze it. The kind of final stage of response action in our world is what we call live terminal, which is a kind of administrative terminal that then we can leverage to really do response if we need to. And we use it as a last resort on our team, where if we don't have some programmatic method to perform the actions that we need, we kind of have a process and procedure that we go through to enable that. You can think of it as like the two guys with the keys to launch the nukes. We're very conservative with how we use it, but we want to make sure that we can also help prevent and stop things from happening at our customers' environments.
So another question is how does an MTR service, how does our MTR service compare to having an internal security operations center or having an internal team member or multiple team members who are managing an endpoint detection and response tool?
Yeah, it's also another really good question where, you know, I like to see it as we can sit very much alongside teams that have those capabilities, and we can work hand in hand. Where you know, we're staffed 24/7. In a lot of cases, other organizations don't. So that's another huge benefit where, you know, they may have like an individual that's responsible for doing cybersecurity or managing kind of the EDR product, but that person, or maybe even several individuals, they have to sleep, they have to go on vacation, where our team's kind of there 24/7, 365 to offer some of offer kind of that support in those off hours, and along with just offering kind of general guidance and expertise to those team members. So there's overlap, yes, in a sense that maybe we might be looking at the same things, but I do see them being a very good thing together, and that we can offer some off-hours support and just general expertise to those people that are working with those tools.
Yeah, generally there's nothing that would prevent you know, an organization from building up an operation like what we have built here at Sophos, and you know, we've worked with organizations that, you know, if you've reached that level of maturity in your security program, you have the resources, and that's going to be, you know, the people, the tools, you've implemented the processes. It's certainly, you know, possible to have these internally. We typically see that with larger enterprises that are able to incorporate some of those elements. And we've actually worked, you know, again, over our past 10 years of providing this work. We've worked with organizations that, you know, did eventually get to the point where, you know, we were helping them as an external partner, and then we helped them further kind of mature their internal operation to the point where they can bring it inside entirely, and that's totally okay. You know, we want organizations to ultimately have all of these capabilities. The reason that a lot of businesses like working with us is because it's just much more cost effective to outsource a solution like this, where, as Matt said, we've got 3 shifts of analysts, and just that in and of itself is very difficult to do, because again, you've got a talent shortage, and it's especially difficult to find analysts who can man those second and third shifts. They're difficult roles to fill. You know, it's having all of the technology at your disposal and having all of those things be integrated together so that you get really that full enterprise-wide visibility. And then it's the process and the experience. It's building out those processes so that you can effectively do the types of work that it takes to detect and respond to these threats. So, and that's why, again, it's so helpful to have a partner like Bytes that we can continue to collaborate with throughout the course of these incidents, so that ultimately, you know, customers don't have to worry about it at all. You know, we've got the team of expert responders working together with the team that's working with your organization on a daily basis, and that's really the perfect union for us. Those are the best situations for us to be in, is when it's the combination of our team with a trusted partner that we've had experience working with.
Okay, thank you so much, Matt and Eric. That's all the questions that we have for today. So thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to join the webinar. I really hope you found it valuable. And thanks to Matt, Eric and Mark for presenting. As I mentioned previously, please do complete the feedback form at the end if you can. And I'll send you all a link to the webinar recording in due course. Thank you again, and have a lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.